Canada is broken, not struggling, not challenged, broken. And the housing market is the proof that has been sitting in plain sight for years, ignored by the people who had every reason to keep ignoring it. Let me tell you something about what has happened to this country. A generation of Canadians, hardworking, tax-paying, rule-following Canadians, has been systematically locked out of the most basic promise that a functioning society makes to its people. The promise that if you work hard enough, if you save diligently enough, if you play by the rules, you can own a home. That promise is gone. It did not fade slowly. It was not eroded by accident. It was broken deliberately, piece by piece, by a political and financial class that benefited enormously from the breaking of it. Millions of Canadians cannot afford a home. That is not a talking point. That is not an exaggeration for rhetorical effect. That is a documented, measurable, undeniable fact. And the market that produced that outcome is not a market that is experiencing temporary turbulence. It is a market that has been structurally, fundamentally, catastrophically broken. The question is not whether that is true. The question is how it happened, who allowed it, and why nobody in power has paid a meaningful price for it. That is what we are going to establish today, methodically, with evidence and without apology. Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the moral case begins. In 1976, the average Canadian home cost roughly 2 times the average annual household income. 2 times. That was the benchmark. That was the ratio that economists and housing analysts pointed to as the standard for an affordable market. A family could save for a few years, build a down payment, qualify for a mortgage, and own a home. That was not a fantasy. That was the lived reality of millions of Canadian families across every province in this country. Fast forward to today, the national average home price in Canada sits above $700,000. In Toronto, that number climbs past $1 million. In Vancouver, it exceeds $1.2 million. Meanwhile, the median household income in Canada hovers around $85,000 annually. Do that math. Do it slowly, because the result deserves to be felt. A median income Canadian household would need to spend more than 8 times their annual income to purchase the average home. In the most expensive cities, that ratio stretches past 12, 13, 14 times annual income. 14 times. Housing economists define anything above 5 times income as severely unaffordable. Canada is not at 5. Canada blew past 5 years ago and never looked back. Think about what that means for a young couple in their late 20s. Both working, both educated, both doing everything right. They cannot save fast enough. The down payment target moves further away every single month because prices rise faster than any savings account can keep pace with. They are not failing. The market is failing them. And that distinction matters enormously because for too long, the political class in this country has framed this as a personal failure rather than a systemic one. But here is the thing about systemic failures. They leave fingerprints, and those fingerprints lead somewhere specific. Now let us talk about how this happened, because it did not happen in a vacuum. There are specific decisions, specific policies, and specific moments where the trajectory of Canadian housing was permanently altered, and understanding those decisions is the only way to understand why the market is where it is today. The first fingerprint is interest rates. For more than a decade following the 2008 financial crisis, the Bank of Canada maintained historically low interest rates. The logic was straightforward. Stimulate borrowing, stimulate spending, stimulate economic recovery. That logic was not entirely wrong in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. But what followed was a decade of cheap money that flooded into the housing market with predictable consequences. When borrowing is artificially cheap, asset prices inflate. When asset prices inflate in a market with constrained supply, they inflate dramatically. The Bank of Canada held rates near the floor for years longer than any reasonable economic justification supported, and the housing market responded exactly the way any economist paying attention would have predicted. The second fingerprint is supply. Canada's major cities, particularly Toronto and Vancouver, failed catastrophically to build enough housing to meet demand. Zoning laws that protected single-family neighborhoods from densification. Lengthy and expensive approval processes that delayed construction by years. NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Institutionalized at the municipal level and protected by provincial governments that were unwilling to override local opposition. The result was a supply crisis layered on top of a demand surge. And that combination is the precise formula for the price explosion that followed. The third fingerprint is foreign investment. For years, Canadian real estate was treated as a global safe haven for capital. Wealthy buyers from overseas, particularly from markets where capital controls made foreign real estate attractive, poured money into Canadian housing markets. Vancouver and Toronto became destinations, not just for people who wanted to live there, but for capital that wanted a stable, appreciating asset in a politically stable country. That capital competed directly with Canadian families for the same limited housing stock, and the Canadian government, for years, did almost nothing meaningful to address it. 3 fingerprints, 3 policy failures, each one compounding the others. And the people who made those decisions are not in prison. Most of them are still in office, or collecting pensions, or sitting on the boards of the very real estate companies that profited from the crisis they created. Let that sit with you for a moment. Now let us talk about who is actually paying the price, because the human cost of this market failure is not abstract. It has names and faces and stories that deserve to be told with the weight they carry. Renters are paying the price. The average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto now exceeds $2,300 per month. In Vancouver, it is higher. Across the country, rental costs have surged in lockstep with ownership costs, because when millions of people are priced out of buying, they compete more intensely for rental units, and landlords respond to that competition by raising rents. This is not a mystery. It is supply and demand operating in a market that has been structurally distorted. The people who cannot afford to buy are not escaping the crisis by renting. They are simply experiencing the crisis in a different form. Young people are paying the price. The homeownership rate among Canadians under 35 has collapsed over the past 2 decades. An entire generation has been effectively told that the wealth-building mechanism that worked for their parents and their grandparents is no longer available to them. The intergenerational transfer of wealth through homeownership, one of the most powerful and historically consistent engines of middle-class financial security, has been severed. Young Canadians are not just renting longer. They are being permanently excluded from a wealth-building system that previous generations accessed as a matter of course. The gap between those who own and those who do not is becoming a defining feature of Canadian economic inequality, and it is growing. New immigrants are paying the price. Canada recruits hundreds of thousands of new permanent residents every year. It markets itself as a land of opportunity, a place where hard work is rewarded, a place where a better life is achievable. And then, those new Canadians arrive and discover that the housing market they have entered is one of the most unaffordable in the world. They compete for the same scarce rental units. They faced the same impossible ownership myth. They were sold a version of Canada that the housing market has made increasingly fictional. And here is the part that should generate genuine outrage. The people making these decisions, the politicians setting housing policy, the central bankers managing interest rates, the municipal officials controlling zoning, almost universally own homes. They are personally insulated from the consequences of their failures. Their net worth appreciates as the crisis deepens. There is a word for a system where the decision makers benefit personally from the failures they refuse to fix. That word is corrupt. Not corrupt in the criminal sense necessarily. Corrupt in the moral sense. Corrupt in the sense that the incentives are fundamentally misaligned with the public interest. Now, let us talk about the government response, because there has been one, and it deserved the scrutiny that honest analysis requires. The federal government under Justin Trudeau, over the course of nearly a decade in power, produced a series of housing initiatives that were announced with fanfare and delivered with failure. The National Housing Strategy, launched in 2017, promised $40 billion over 10 years to address housing affordability. It did not bend the curve. Prices continued to rise. Homelessness continued to grow. Affordability continued to worsen by virtually every measurable metric. The strategy was not a solution. It was a press release dressed up as policy. The first-time home buyer incentive was introduced to help Canadians enter the market by offering shared equity arrangements with the government. It was cancelled in 2024, having failed to generate meaningful uptake or meaningful results. The program was poorly designed, poorly targeted, and poorly executed. It was the housing policy equivalent of bringing a garden hose to a forest fire. The foreign buyer ban, introduced in 2023, prohibited non-Canadians from purchasing residential property in Canada. The intent was legitimate. The execution was riddled with exemptions and limitations that blunted its impact significantly. And by the time it was implemented, foreign investment was already one component of a multi-layered crisis that required multi-layered solutions. A partial measure applied late is not a solution. It is the appearance of action in the absence of it. The Trudeau government was in power for nearly a decade during which Canadian housing became among the least affordable in the developed world, during which the ownership dreams of an entire generation were extinguished, during which the rental market became a source of financial desperation rather than a stable foundation. And at the end of that decade, the government's defenders argued that housing is primarily a provincial and municipal responsibility, that the federal government's tools are limited, that the problems are complex. They are complex, that is true. But complexity is not an excuse for failure at this scale. When a generation cannot afford homes, the government that presided over that outcome owns it, fully, completely, without qualification. But here is the thing about political failure. It does not exist in isolation. There is always an industry that benefits from the status quo, always a donor class that prefers inaction, always a financial interest that is served by the continuation of the crisis. Let us name it plainly. The Canadian real estate industry, developers, investors, real estate agents, mortgage lenders, has a direct financial interest in high home prices. Every year that prices remain elevated, every year that the market remains inaccessible to first-time buyers, is a year in which existing owners accumulate more wealth. Developers sell fewer units at higher margins, and the financial industry collects more interest on larger mortgages. The incentive structure of the Canadian housing market is built to perpetuate the crisis, not resolve it. And the political donations, the lobbying expenditures, the revolving door between government and industry, all of it serves that perpetuation. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural observation about incentives. Follow the money. Ask who benefits from the status quo. Ask who funds the political campaigns of the people who set housing policy. The answers are not comfortable. They are not complicated. They are damning. Now let us talk about what a real solution would actually look like, because this conversation cannot end at diagnosis. The scale of the problem demands a serious accounting of what it would take to fix it. First, supply. Canada needs to build housing at a pace and scale it has never sustained before. That means overriding exclusionary zoning at the municipal level with provincial and federal intervention. It means streamlining approval processes so that the time between a developer's application and a shovel in the ground is measured in months, not years. It means incentivizing density, not as a punishment for existing homeowners, but as the only mathematically viable path to making housing affordable in cities where land is finite. Every city that has meaningfully improved affordability in the developed world has done so by dramatically increasing supply. There is no example of a city that solved a housing crisis by restricting supply more carefully. None. Second, demand management. Not all demand is equal. The demand of a Canadian family trying to buy their first home is not the same as the demand of a foreign investor seeking a capital haven or a domestic speculator purchasing a 10th property for rental income. Tax policy can distinguish between these categories: vacancy taxes, speculation taxes, progressive property taxation that discourages the accumulation of multiple properties. These tools exist. Other countries have deployed them. Canada has deployed them partially, timidly, and late. A serious government would deploy them comprehensively and unapologetically. Third, public and non-market housing. The private market, operating alone, will not produce affordable housing in sufficient quantities because affordable housing is less profitable than market-rate housing. That is not an ideological statement. It is an economic reality. Governments that have successfully maintained housing affordability for lower-income residents have done so through sustained investment in public and cooperative housing that operates outside the profit-driven market. Canada largely dismantled its social housing infrastructure in the 1990s. Rebuilding it is not optional. It is necessary. Fourth, accountability. The politicians, the planners, the central bankers, and the regulators who presided over this crisis need to face genuine political consequences, not symbolic hearings, not commissioned reports that sit on shelves. Actual electoral accountability, where the failure to deliver affordable housing is treated as the serious governance failure that it is, rather than one issue among many, to be managed and spun. These solutions are not radical. They are not ideologically extreme. They are the policy toolkit that serious countries deploy when serious problems demand serious responses. Canada has not deployed them seriously, and millions of Canadians are living with the consequences of that failure every single day. Let me bring this home, because ultimately, this is not a story about policy. It is a story about people. It is a story about what a society owes to the people who build it, who staff its hospitals and drive its buses and teach its children and fill its warehouses and serve its food. It is a story about whether Canada is going to remain the kind of country where ordinary people can build ordinary lives, or whether it is going to calcify into a two-tiered society where the already wealthy accumulate more wealth through asset appreciation while everyone else falls further behind. The housing crisis is the defining domestic failure of this generation of Canadian political leadership. It is the clearest possible evidence that the people entrusted with governing this country in the public interest have instead governed it in the interest of those who already have. The moral clarity of that failure is not complicated. It is not nuanced. It is stark. Millions of Canadians cannot afford a home. The market that produced that outcome is broken. The political class that allowed it to happen has not been held accountable. And until the incentive structure changes, until the supply crisis is addressed with genuine urgency, until demand is managed with genuine seriousness, until public housing is rebuilt with genuine investment, the crisis will deepen. The generation locked out today will be joined by the generation behind them. And the promise that Canada made to the people who built it will remain broken. That is where we are. That is what the evidence shows. And that is what every Canadian who cannot afford a home deserves to hear, said plainly, without spin, without apology, and without the pretense that this was inevitable or accidental or beyond anyone's control. It was not. It is not. And the reckoning for it is long overdue.